Satu Dewa Perang Tujuh Ratu opens like a flame held beneath a bowl of ink, shadows stirring first, then a low tremor of light, and somewhere in that quiet, a heartbeat counting the cost of return. On Bongo Gaming, this is not a platform so much as a doorway, not a channel, but a corridor hushed by midnight, where you set your hand upon old wood and feel the memory of every knuckle that pushed it open before you. The film does not greet you, it studies you. It invites your breath to align with a pulse measured in grief and resolve, and as the first frame takes hold, your gaze widens to receive a world where violence moves with the rhythm of calligraphy, and mercy is a blade concealed in a parenthesis of silence. The image is lacquered with smoke as if time itself had been rendered soluble. Ash falls the way slow snow does in regret, each flake catching a sallow gleam from a lantern cut to half shade. The camera, patient and almost priestly, drifts along a ruined threshold that could be temple or home or prison, you cannot tell yet, and it does not matter. What matters is the way the light stares back. It is not the heroic blaze of redemption, not the theatrical darkness of myth. It is a color you recognize in the tired underbellies of dawn, a bruised blue edging into damp gold, and beneath it, a hum, thin wire vibrating, a note sustained longer than a lung should tolerate. The frame acknowledges your suspicion that vengeance is pure, then takes it away with a turn of the wrist, showing a door ajar not to welcome you in but to suggest you have already been inside. Lin Wuya arrives in that unhurried way of men who know the hinges of death by their proper names. He is the king returning to the underworld not as a conqueror, but as a custodian of unfinished business. You feel it in the way his shoulders don't slouch with fatigue, they balance with study, like leveled scales. His eyes keep low to the middle distance, sifting details that the script never says aloud, a thread scorched without burning through, soot lodged in the crease where a portrait used to hang. This is how mourning performs itself when all large displays have gone stale. It becomes a detective, it learns to hear in plaster the murmur of what once lived inside it. He does not find evidence, he listens to residue. And the camera, tight when it needs the discipline of a confession, wide when it needs to measure the loneliness of corridors, treats his presence as the metronome of the entire design. There is a room early on where breath composes the geometry of the scene. You won't remember furniture from it, only the slow procession of motes caught in a slit of sun, floating like unsent letters. The sound design shifts in such a way that you realize silence is not emptiness, it is architecture. A far-off wooden clapper repeats at patient intervals, striking not to count time but to thrum you back into your body. A low scraped chord, something between a guqin and a cavern's throat, arches beneath, letting a soft chime, could be gamelan, could be the delicate collision of porcelain, bead moisture along its length. Each note lands like a foot on a floor that remembers its maker. In Satu Dewa Perang Tujuh Ratu, memory is not just content, it is acoustics. Lin Wuya's footfalls calibrate the hall as if testing whether this home will tolerate his questions. He is not the sort of protagonist who offers his face the way altars offer candlesticks. He withholds, and the actor understands the power of minimal confession. The jaw tightens not into hardness but into intention, an index of words that will not be said until they have been earned. The mouth remains composed, neither smirk nor line of dust. His lips register breath, tiny enlargements on the outflow that betray when he has seen what will change him. The eyes, though, there is the gulf. There is a private sea. You watch micro-adjustments at their corners connote decisions you do not fully parse until later, a flicker like a fish, a narrowing that sharpens not into suspicion but the foresight of grief. He is not hiding, he is protecting the velocity of his thoughts, and the film trusts you to trust that. The queens arrive like weather systems that refuse to be catalogued. They are introduced not as ornaments or foils but as climates, each with a temperature that bends whatever stands too near. One steps into frame with a mantle that glimmers under the light like frost at noon, and you can taste the clean edge of her boundaries on the air, a bracing refusal that sharpens the shot. Another appears the way rivers appear on maps, a course plain to see, but the currents held in their own counsel. A third will not be still, not physically, the camera holds her with stately warmth, but emotionally, she inhabits motion as if stasis would allow the past to catch her. There is one whose eyes are lanterns lit for the dead, one who smiles as if to check whether joy still has a pulse, one who speaks with the accuracy of a drawn bow, and one who is silent the way closed books are silent, full of life already written, waiting for the right touch to reanimate ink into intention. The film offers them not as exceptions to a world of men, but as the gravity that prevents that world from disintegrating. Costume is no afterthought here, it is testimony. Fabrics carry dialects. Weaves undulate like remembered rice fields in a wind America never learned. Silk that should pour under light instead absorbs it, forcing the lens to lean forward and earn its shimmer. A sleeve unfurls and the eye can hear the sibilance of thread, the way a blade will later chase the same S before biting into a thicker consonant. Patterns speak in recursive motifs, a spiral that reappears as shadow on a wall, as the spiral of steam above a tea bowl, as the spiral of a choice that returns in a disguised shape. Color behaves as theology. Vermilion is not merely red, it is blood after it has knelt for forgiveness. Jade is not merely green, it is the question of what refuses decay. Opal dawns on metal that has not killed in a while. This is costume design as a path, where cloth is liturgy and seam is sutra. The lens is in love with thresholds. Doors frame faces like proverbs frame behavior, blunt and decorative and devastating when you consider the wood is not only carved to be beautiful, but to keep certain breezes from unwell lungs. Corners are not traps, they are pivots. The camera will deny you the straight line of revelation, it prefers a patient round to an impatient thrust. A slow lateral move becomes the longest corridor in the world, a hallway that might fold like paper if only you breathe at the correct length. When the camera rises, it feels less like a crane and more like a gaze forced to become a god in order to see certain truths without burning. The cuts comply with grief's cadence, they do not simply bridge time, they accrete it, layers of lacquer applied so thin you cannot measure them except in how the shine has deepened, how the hand that touches it pulls back with a finer tremor. Lin Wuya's power does not swagger. It occupies space at the exact volume of necessity. When he stands still, combat is already in session, one can tell by the way the sound of cloth crisping against his side announces friction absent, friction anticipated. He does not show you how he knows, he allows you to watch knowledge accumulate on him in dust and decision. The underworld king is a paradox, he administers order to the ungovernable while knowing that order can be the deadliest of tyrannies when unobserved. The moral center shifts under every step because he insists morality is not a throne but a tightrope, a high wire strung across the mouth of sorrow. So he treads, and the camera's breath sinks to his. Movement becomes the language of a man who refuses to overstate what is already screaming. The first significant encounter with a queen lacquers the air with caution. She is older than the notion of apology. Her hair holds pins that could suture a torn flag. She sits with a straightness that once taught straightness to others, and her gaze is the sort of thing that knows you before you are introduced. The blocking composes him just to her left, a half step behind, not in subservience, but respectful to the mathematics of presence. He watches her the way children listen to thunder, alert but not yet afraid. When she speaks, the words do not carry on their own, the room leans to help them. Every surface repeats at a sympathetic frequency. And you understand that power here will be the art of attention, the rarest of gifts in cinematography because it cannot be faked by focus pulls or loaded monologues. You either witness, you do not. This film witnesses. Sound pours itself into secrecy. Footsteps on matte stone are almost silence, footsteps on lacquered wood are pens in margin, scribbling amendments that quicken the heart. Droplets find a bucket somewhere out of frame, consistent and unremarkable until a revelation slows your breathing enough to count the seconds between drips and realize the interval has narrowed, the scene is thickening. A bowl slides a few centimeters, the ceramic note clear as scripture. Metal meets metal with a romance that does not require error to be exciting, the chime is so precise it could pass as a moral argument. And when the percussive bed arrives, it arrives the way a memory does that you did not know you were missing. Low drums neither martial nor thunderous, just the sound of weight measuring a floor and finding it can bear more. Then the thin string beneath, sprayed with rosin grief, draws a line from one ear to another, tying the listener to the listener, braiding the room into a single organ of adjudication. There is an economy to the action that refuses cinematic gluttony. Violence, when it enters, is not spectacle, it is punctuation. A cut opens not to show you the blade, but to show you the argument that made the blade necessary. The choreography keeps its sentences short. A reach, a turn, a shift of stance that places one foot just behind the other exactly enough to change the entire topology of the fight. Linen breathes, leather remembers, and flesh does not assume invulnerability. Notice the camera does not ride the blade, it rides decisions. It lingers on the muscle that tightens before the cut, the hip that cedes an inch to keep the rib unshattered, the eye that decides 2 beats before the arm follows. There is blood, yes, but it behaves like ink. When it appears, the color suddenly owns the frame, and you have to read what it says before the next motion wipes the meaning clean. The queens are not an array, they are an octave. Each carries a note that, when played in isolation, tells you who she has been forced to be. When they share space, something else composes itself, not harmony, too easy, too decorative. This is counterpoint, the rigor of difference maintaining one room without annihilation. One queen's voice is a riverbed refusing silt. Another's is smoke that has learned to coil. A third speaks rarely, and when she does, time adopts her syntax. The oldest moves an inch and the frame recalibrates its spine. The youngest is not young, she wears youth like some wear cardigans, practical, borrowed, steaming at the edges where fear threatens to show. Together they offer the sort of shelter that frightens men who believe safety must always be purchased with obedience. Their shelter is earned by listening. The film arranges their scenes as if teaching you how to learn, first by observing, then by admitting that your observations were instruments of vanity, then by consenting to what the scene itself asks of your attention. What I admire most is the film's refusal of fever. Revenge stories love to run. They froth themselves into breathlessness, so that urgency can launder their shallow ends. Here, urgency is not speed, it is the artistry of continuous focus. The edit does not swing aside, it trims with shears. Transitions occur as if the wall itself had stepped politely aside. Dissolves mimic breath on a window, you see what's next only through the proof of what's fogged. The very way a scene ends, sliding the light down a degree, hum receding, suggests doors closed quietly because children sleep in the next room. You attend to everything as if you were in a house mourning but not despondent. And it is there you realize the irony. Time moves quickest when you are allowed to notice it moving at all. The film's moral palette is punished by nuance. Dark forces appear not as otherworldly apparitions with the convenient etiquette of pure malice, instead they show up in the signatures stamped in red wax that look suspiciously like dried blood, in officials who speak like learned men while studying the elasticity of cruelty, in laws so elegantly phrased they can be shaped around a person's throat without leaving fingerprints. Lin Wuya understands he must destroy something larger than individuals and smaller than fate. He must unmake the muscle memory of a society that bows too easily to the wrong kind of power. He fights offices. He fights paperwork. He fights the arithmetic of fear distributed with bureaucratic skill. And when he defends the queens, it is not the gesture of a chivalry long glazed by nostalgia. He protects the lives that teach him restraint so he does not become the thing he most effectively dismantles. There is a sequence in which Rain practices monastic discipline. It does not pelt, it studies. Droplets pattern the courtyard with a consistency that would be soothing if not for the image of a man's hand hovering above a blade as if checking whether a stove is still lit. The palette here is the color of old silver, stone wet to the point of mirror. The camera lowers its voice and backs away by inches as if to let a confession confess itself. Wuya steps where there is no puddle to avoid splashing onto the name carved there, a queen, whose elegance renders cruelty ashamed of itself, watches without interfering. She trusts him to interpret the rules of this space by his breathing alone. When conflict finally surfaces, the movements are as spare as the architecture. A foot sliding. A sleeve flicking water into an opponent's eyes not to blind, but to buy the count of 3 heartbeats necessary to redirect a thrust away from a column that remembers all the shoulders that have leaned upon it. Injury is minimized as if by covenant, until the moment harm cannot be converted into lesson anymore. Only then does a strike land, and even then the camera cleaves to the face, not the wound, watching the shock of understanding break across it like light jammed through a small window. Dialogue sails under the wind the way fishing boats do near a shoreline they have learned by heart. It rarely arrives at a point, it rings the point like bells sewn in a hem, reminding you the body is already dancing. Listen to the grammar of pause. The queens deploy silence differently, one withdraws to let the other fill, One interrupts to confirm the ground stability before this bridge of words allows anyone to cross. One lets a phrase die in mid-flight because its continuation would be a sin. Lin Wuya understands that to speak while grieving is to risk lying with rhythm. He chooses words like spoons, choosing the right measure to taste something bitter enough to be truth. And you as the viewer learn a strange etiquette. You lean in, but do not pry. You anticipate, but do not coerce. The film permits access the way gardens do, through paths that appear only when walked slowly. We must talk about hands. Too much criticism laps the shore of faces and leaves entire oceans uncharted. In Satu Dewa Perang, Tujuh Ratu, hands are the subtext driven into plain sight. Wuya's hands hold the contradiction of tenderness practiced at a strike speed. When he touches an injured wrist, he rotates it with the familiarity of anatomy learned from regret, where to press, where not to, how to offer gravity so the joint may return to its argument with the body. The Queen's hands tell their biographies. One keeps her fingers so close you wonder what has tried to rip her. Another spreads them on the table in deliberation, an open palm so forthright that even the camera softens. A third drums with two fingers on the lip of a cup, unafraid of impatience but unwilling to be governed by it. The film makes you understand that the body records choices with a fidelity memory cannot match. These hands say, we endured, we calibrated, we refused to become simply symbolic. Shadows are not black here, they are history given form. They pool in corners like ink pots overturned by a clerk startled into revelation. They climb walls like ivy learning to spell. A queen steps, and her silhouette arrives a second before her, dragging an old promise across the floor. Lin Wuya stands in a doorway and the darkness cuts him clean to two halves. One man shapes the present, the other mans the watchtower of the past, neither permitted to take leave. The lighting is patient. It does not spotlight, it persuades objects to confess their textures. Wood shows its pores. Stone keeps its cold. Skin glows with the last generosity the body offers the world. And in all this, the camera hardly ever lies flat, it tilts with empathy. If a queen leans, the horizon tilts to accommodate the reality that her balance is the scene's balance. If Wuya straightens, the frame breathes out, grateful. What about movement through crowd? The film stages group spaces like opera performed by people who no longer remember that opera is supposed to be sung. In a market lit from above by a grid of humble lamps, humanity occurs with a tenderness not always afforded in this genre. Extras are not extras, they are texture. A shawl's edge catches on a nail, a cart's wheel squeals because the world is not perfectly maintained, a ribbon of steam from dumplings braids itself through all faces and dissolves petty distinctions. When conflict threads itself into this tapestry, it takes care. Wuya's body navigates elbows and baskets and small lives the way a river moves through sediment, causing almost nothing to break until breaking is the only instruction left. You feel the ethics of it, care as choreography, refusal to pretend that the environment isn't already home to people who cannot just afford to watch two principles determine the fate of the afternoon. There is an interlude that refuses to announce itself. The screen shifts toward cooler blues, the sound dampens to the density of felt, and you find yourself among ledgers that outnumber stars you have seen. The underworld in this film is not lava and horn. It is bureaucracy marinated in fear, the ceiling low with edicts, the floor patient beneath the weight of all those footsteps that believed documents would preserve them. Stamps slap with sick satisfaction, a rhythm that could be mistaken for productivity if you weren't paying attention to the ink's insistence that everything you sign leaks into consequence. Wuya understands these halls as well as any battle. He knows power hides in administrative grammar. He watches for the clause that rescues the murderer, the preposition that lodges between a person and their personhood. And when he smiles, it is not victory, it is recognition of how cunning can be turned upon cunning, how order can be pressed to birth justice or, failing that, guilt. A queen guides him through these corridors with a gaze that has never forgiven paper. She refuses to look at pages when men are in the room, as if eye contact with documents would grant them the authority men desperately want them to have. She teaches him the contour of a law's exhaustion by running her finger down the margin and pausing where the scribe's hands must have cramped. And he learns, the way one learns to dance with a partner who is believed to lead but is being led, how to place pressure at angles that persuade systems to shame themselves. It is not flamboyance. It is not revolution as anthem. It is the quiet skill of residues gathering mass, of long afternoons teaching eyes to read what the author did not intend them to. Let us not forget the film's bravery in honoring women's age. Cinema, so often infatuated with its own reflection, makes a virgin of time and pretends it never kisses back with consequence. Here, faces show the sweetness of being used. Lines do not mar, they narrate. The camera swears fealty to dignity without embalming it. Bodies move with the captivating physics of experience, speed spent on accuracy, glamour reallocated to presence. One queen laughs in a way that proves laughter does not betray sorrow, it brightens it to a bearable temperature. Another refuses tears not from scorn of vulnerability but from a discipline that knows certain rooms listen with too much appetite. The youngest will not be youngest long, watch her watch the elders and steal technique, as plants steal from sun without guilt because sunlight is the one thing given to be stolen. The score regards all of this with the necessary audacity. Instruments converse as if across centuries. A bamboo flute carries a melody that insists on continuing even when it sleeps for 8 bars, its return is the return of air to lungs after a plunge. Against it, strings apply a sheen of contained sorrow, not the weeping you recognize, something closer to the ache that follows weeping when it has accomplished nothing visible. Percussion is used with medical restraint. It does not dramatize to compensate the viewer's shortness of breath, it guides breath to lengthen, to be equal to what is before it. The rare introduction of a choral element startles not because of vocal beauty but because of the suggestion that we are being addressed from behind ourselves, by voices that have been waiting under the floorboards the whole time, patient as fungi. A mirror becomes the film's most ferocious ally. In a room where candles seem to have learned to melt upward, Lin Wuya studies a reflection that lies to him carefully. The glass is old, warped at corners, and you notice that the edges of his image wobble before the center does, the way conviction must be approached from periphery to be dissolved. A queen steps behind him so precisely you want to believe the footprint into which she places her foot is always ready, always there. She does not touch him. She is the kind of presence that can wrap a body without a hand. He looks at their combination in the mirror not to admire coupling, but to estimate the distance between what he presents and what he is about to become. The candles do not flicker, they reorient. The flame leans in worship, or warning. You cannot decide. Neither can he. The glass waits without opinion. It has seen more faces than saints have, and prays for none. Editing arranges time as if it had borrowed a loom. Threads you thought dead reappear, not as flashback, not as exposition, but as thread crossing thread. A shot of a boy in a threshold appears not to tell you who the boy is, if you have not guessed, the film refuses to help, but to remind you that thresholds breed boys and women and disasters alike. A shot of a pouring kettle returns 40 minutes later inverted, water traveling upward into steam holding shape as if memory had made architecture out of gas. The film denies you catharsis as solution while giving you something rarer, recognition as practice. You learn to see pattern not as predestination but as invitation to intervene. It would be simple to say that Lin Wuya destroys the dark forces by precisely applying violence. The truth is more intimate and unadorned. He annihilates in himself the romance with annihilation, and then he sets to work. He chooses, over and over, where not to cut. He sacrifices grandeur for accuracy, because what harms institutions is not the grand gesture, it is the correctly placed absence, the yawning wound of refusal where they expected complicity. When the softest queen reaches for his wrist in a hall filled with people who misread softness as permission and grips his pulse with a pressure practiced from years of bending bone back into friendship with socket, he stops. The hall slows to a jealousy of their mercy. And somewhere in the balcony of the soundscape, a single bell hushes itself, the strike imminent but withheld, because even bells prefer to mark what birth does in quiet. Watch how the camera studies his mouth when he hears a certain name. The name is not delivered with bile, it is handed plain as rice, and the film respects you sufficiently to refuse uppercase letters for villains. Wuya swallows and does not lick his lips first because thirst is not to be eroticized. The throat flex is microscopic, the sort of motion that editors love to scissor for pace and that this editor protects like a seed. If you blink, you will still feel it. If you close your eyes, your own throat will echo the flex as empathy, a mirror neuron accepting a prayer too low for choir. He does not run. He breathes. A queen sidesteps into his peripheral composition, not to catch him, but to demonstrate that collapse is not an option yet. Collapse, it will say later, is a ritual to be performed in private, in the company of a teacup. The film's theology comes into focus under rain that has stopped but not explained itself. There is a temple that has remembered its incense too long and thus now smells like unresolved things. Wuya kneels, but not to worship, to borrow proximity to ground. The queens arrange themselves not behind him, not beside, but around, each assuming a cardinal point not because it looks pretty from above, but because the wind requires their measures to keep malevolent drafts from suffocating him. You could mistake this circle for protection. It is fiercer, it is interrogation in the key of love. They do not ask questions, they hold positions until his honesty rises of its own heat. The camera respects the circle, refusing the criminal impulse to penetrate it for angles. We watch from a respectful oblique, feel excluded in the correct way. Exclusion is a pedagogy, it teaches desire to behave. Some argue action is cinema's first religion. Here action kneels to the sacrament of restraint, then bursts, briefly, into tongues when mercy fails to translate. A courtyard fight becomes an essay in what not to use. The blade remains sheathed so long you forget the sheath can be more dangerous than the blade itself, its bluntness bruising to teach, its weight dissuading future attempts. He counts opponents not to measure odds, but to ensure none will be pushed into a stairwell where a child sits with a lantern and a handful of wind. And when violence finally cracks the lacquer, the only word for the sound is honest. Blood opens on the stone like calligraphy cut by a teacher who has tired of hints. For a breath and a half, you are allowed to be afraid for him. The film takes your fear politely, then hands it back, altered. You are no longer afraid for his life, you are afraid for what he will have to forgive himself for surviving. How the film holds water deserves praise separate from the color grade. In bowls, water behaves like rooms do under grief, surface tension high, easy to break with a touch, suspicious of all sky. In channels, it proves that softness can carve the most obstinate architecture. The sound of it is never pretty. Instead we get the sibilance of modest flows, the clap of a pail receiving its labor, the hiss of pour onto iron, the gossip of streams where secrets are rinsed but not removed. In one scene a queen rinses her hands with such deliberation your own knuckles tingle, the knotted places remembering tasks they have not completed. She cups her palm to catch the last falling thread and lets it go only when the air has learned to keep it. There is an astonishing quiet in the scene that follows. A long corridor lined with windows gives into dusk. Dusk chooses columns of light the way monks choose vows, each speck consenting to a certain angle of attention. The windows are lattice, not bars, and you remember all at once that pattern can imprison and liberate depending on the eye that reads it. Wuya passes a pane whose glass has cracked not from violence, but from time acquiring leverage. He stops and places one finger on the fracture. The crack lengthens fraction by indulgent fraction. He speaks a word not to the glass, but to the idea of inevitable rupture. The queen behind him does not admonish. She allows him this too small ritual and in so doing grants it the dimension of liturgy. He is not breaking anything. He is acknowledging it was already mid-break when he arrived. Every performance breathes the exact air its scene can afford. Watch how a queen's nostrils flare when the room is deprived of hope for a second too long. That flare is not anger, it is the body searching for additional intake when ideas no longer suffice. Another queen's blink rate slows in the precise proportion of her rising clarity. Yet another refuses to sit where etiquette insists, choosing instead a beam in shadow where she collaborates with invisibility better than any man in that building ever will. The acting is devotional. It refuses gesture inflation. It memoizes the truth that when people are afraid but competent, they do not exhibit fear like banners, they refine their efficiency. Wuya returns this reverence by lowering his stature in rooms where knowledge is stored in spines curve by curve. Authority cannot tolerate shared air. He invites it anyway. If there is a recurring symbol, it is not the sword or the crown, it is the cup. Tea, water, wine, containers of temperature. Cups in this film do not clink frivolously. They are struck like bells. Lin Wuya's fingers circle a rim, not to fidget, but to rehearse the circumference of a choice. A queen places her palm over a cup's mouth to warm it faster, to coax comfort from a liquid unprepared to give. In a later moment that refuses to be obvious, a cup cracks audibly off-screen, and the shot does not flinch to show you. It remains on a face that did not need to turn to know the sound, because some fractures are family. Sound suggests what sight must not take from dignity. Tragedy arrived, we did not break. The film's Kate grows braver with color when death stops pretending to be shy. Vermilion mounts the scene not as blood too eager to make a point, but as confidence regained at an immoral pace. Blacks thicken into blues that remember mountains. Whites stop apologizing. Shadow maintains itself, stiffening at the edges like starch applied to cloth that must convey respect in the way it drapes alone. Night is not a regime. It is another room. And in night rooms are their own lit candles, eyes develop flame, cheekbones learn to host it, and you understand why hunters give up when prey becomes its own lamp. There is a narrow bridge of reeds that behaves like a thought right before confession. The river does not churn, it withholds. The bridge sways as if bored with human urgency and intent on arresting it into dance. Wuya steps onto it alone first, then signals, not with macho flourish but with a tiny tilting of head, that one queen should follow, the exact one who knows the trick of shifting weight with a laugh when fear wants to stiffen joints into idiocy. She does, and the bridge complains audibly, a thin wooden sentence clear as remorse. The camera does not indulge a wide, it stays intolerably close, as if the stakes demand touch. When the other side arrives at their feet, no triumph attends. They are 2 breaths closer to a truth that might burn their throats. They stand and do not look back. The reeds sing a lullaby to water that no child will learn because it is in a dialect spoken only by structures that outlived their architects. Truth approaches in the shape of a lullaby. It threads itself through the score shamelessly, the way childhood intrudes upon veteran minds when the day empties into evening. Lin Wuya hears it first not as melody but as temperature. The room warms by a degree that feels like regret. And then the notes, familiar to him in a way that should not be possible, begin to arrange themselves in his chest. He does not weep, he revises posture. A queen removes a pin from her hair the way a mother removes a thorn from a heel, careful, with a glance that refuses future bleeding. She lays it on a table too politely to feign indifference, and the room decides it will not breathe until someone explains themselves. Of course no one does. Explanation is the privilege of those unscarred by implication. If structuring guilt could be set to choreography, the film would. Instead, it slows everyone's exhale. A hallway closes like ribs. A curtain draws as if handless, a gesture wizard by draft any set would envy. He stands in the middle of a room that decided a long time ago it would practice truth by architecture, beams honest in their reveal, knots proud to have knotted back, paint off in honorable chips. The queens fold into places they know will receive them whole. He stands without furniture. The shot holds until your eyes plead for release. No cut. No solace. Just breath and a sound at the very bottom of hearing, like a prayer someone hums under a stair, because life continues alongside revelation, not in apology to it. Somewhere not far, proximity arranged by the logic of guilt, a bell tethered to wind stirs like a memory that wants to be forgiven but has become skilled at incarceration. The bell's voice is not bright, not temple clean. It drags the last syllable like cloth over stone. Wuya closes his eyes to listen the way you close your eyes before an impact you respect, not as cowardice, but as concentration. A queen across the room studies him without rescue. The others, keepers of their own fields, adjust to form a geometry only the camera can prove exists, a convex vow around a man about to admit he grew teeth in the house of who. The wind intensifies. The bell regrets. The door quivers in its frame. Then the lullaby becomes words it should never have remembered. It leans into phonemes he thought he had buried with the last of marrow hope, and the lyric completes itself on the wrong tongue. Echoes are treacherous that way, they do not ask permission to reveal. His mouth opens, but not to sing. Not to answer. Air enters as if it must pass a gate, an intake unique in its sound, as if his throat has practiced denying this for so long it forgot how to admit. What returns to him now is not merely origin, but an accusation, gift-wrapped as memory, written in the steady ink of a voice he will have to name aloud to make real. And from somewhere behind the lintel, the shape of the doorway darkens into a silhouette that knows him, that studied the grammar of his shoulders long before fate forged a crown for the underworld and asked him to wear it without a father's hands to adjust the tilt. Satu Dewa Perang Tujuh Ratu arrives like a blade unsheathed in a quiet temple, and here on Bongo Gaming we don't watch from a safe distance, we step through the smoke, let the ash settle on our tongue, and listen for the heartbeat of a film that calls itself a myth and feels like a confession. There's no prelude, no handrail, just the sensation of a door sliding open to a corridor of lacquered black, a single lantern left breathing in the wind, and a name, Lin Wuya, pressed onto the palette of the night like a seal stamped into wet clay. You can feel the frame lean closer before your eyes do. You can feel the score pull its first hushed thread. The world narrows to a footfall, to a pulse, to the memory of a massacre fraying like silk caught on a nail. The first image makes a promise it keeps for the next hours, that violence here is a geometry of grief and that heroism is not thunder but marrow. A long, patient track pushes through a street that's less a place than a wound, stone slick with recent rain, roof tiles bowed like tired shoulders, baskets of pomegranates split open in the gutter as if the city bled and then kept walking. The camera doesn't hurry, it listens. The shuffle of a sweeping broom chews at the edge of silence, a child's laughter blooms too brightly and dies as if embarrassed to be alive, and beneath everything the distant alloy shimmer of gamelan, soft as breath against glass, runs like a river current. It's not east or west, not one tradition declared loudly, but a knit of textures, bamboo hiss, low drum on the bile of the earth, little bells cutting the distance into measurable pain. Then a hand drifts into the frame, scar-scattered knuckles, fingers that do not tremble, and in the reflection of a rain puddle we meet eyes that could make gods blink. Lin Wuya is not introduced, he happens to the light. The camera approaches him like a memory unsure if it wants to be remembered, hanging just behind his shoulder, letting the nape of his neck and the edge of his ear sketch our intimacy. Freedom feels like a trap he politely tolerates. A woman crosses frame with a basket of herbs so aromatic you swear scent turns visible, and for a blink, less than that, his gaze follows the motion, not in lust or calculation but the way a wolf recognizes a brook. The micro-expression is a choreography of three muscles, a tiny uplifting of the cheek that never becomes a smile, an almost imperceptible squint of the left eye as if measuring the weight of a leaf, and the slightest tightening at the edge of his mouth that reads like a vow he doesn't intend to say aloud. The film thrives in those nearly invisible storms. It doesn't shout. It lets tendons speak. We are told he's the king of the underworld not through exposition but by how the world behaves around him. Lanterns sway inward when he steps beneath them. Men brave enough to be cruel fall quiet without understanding why. The shot selection suggests rulership as sensitive gravity, he is a stone at the bottom of a river that never asks the current to bend and yet it bends. But if power is shape, grief is texture, and there's texture in the way he stands at the threshold of his family's gate, not crossing, just staring at the wooden beam still charred at the ends where someone tried to burn it and failed, as if the fire lost courage. He checks the grain with a thumb. It's a caress he's too proud to admit missing. This is where the ghosts begin their work, and the film understands ghosts are not see-through figures in corridors, they are habits that survived us. The palette is brittle jade and clotted red, ash on temple white. This is a world lacquered against time, but you can scrape a nail on it and see the wood underneath, raw and susceptible. Inside the family compound the air hangs like damp silk. We're led room to room with no score, only the rattle of a loose window latch, the seaside far away even if there is no sea. Each space feels like an argument not yet finished, a table pushed a half-inch away from its mark, a teacup set back with the handle turned the wrong direction, a calligraphy scroll slightly off plumb so the poem slants as if leaning against an invisible shoulder. These are not props, they are testimonies. The composition insists that absence is something you can light. A portrait of an ancestor faces the wrong way, toward the corner. You can read 10 possible meanings into it and the film allows all 10 to be true without redundancy. Was it punishment? Mercy? Defiance? An anxious child's mistake? Lin Wuya does not correct it, he bows his head instead, and the camera bows too, a gentle tilt that acknowledges a contract with the dead. The cinematography speaks a language of courtesy and innuendo, angles that apologize, shadows that admit to listening. Every slow pan is a sentence ending in a comma, never a period. The edit cuts on breathing, not on motion, so the frame sometimes lingers one breath past meaning. That's where the 8 collects. The 7 women appear not as a council but as weather patterns, each arriving with her own season. The film avoids introductions the way a monk avoids conversation, it prefers recognition to name tags. The first queen is felt before she is seen, a chime of bone rings and a scent of heated iron, and when she steps into the yard the light learns a new set of manners. She wears age like a weapon that cannot be stolen. Her hair, pinned back with a strip of black silk, catches one thread of lantern fire and refuses to let it go. She doesn't smile. She allows you to notice she could. Her presence reframes the shot. Suddenly what mattered was not the doorway but the hinge, not the face but the temple pulse. And when she regards Lin Wuya, you see a small nod that is not greeting but triage. In one glance she has sutured wounds no one else could see. Another queen descends the steps with a gait that suggests wind more than bone, her sleeve writes air, and the cut follows it, slight slow motion as if the fabric were dictating time. She is not young, and the camera loves her not because she isn't but because her stillness is chosen rather than learned. When she sits, silence makes room for her. The edit denies us close-ups of faces for a while, prefers the grammar of hands, calloused fingers arranging tea implements, the dexterity of wrists carrying their own private histories. We read the scene through ceremony, how hot water is poured and allowed to overflow a cup like rain resisting obedience, how a napkin is folded inward at the corner rather than out, how Lin Wuya waits half a heartbeat too long before touching the steaming porcelain, accepting the scalding gladly, as if pain can pass for penance when nothing else will do. Sound design stages its own duel with our nerves. Far off, the metallic bicycle of gamelan repeats a figure that first feels like guilt and later becomes recognition. Here, right here, the kettle's whisper grows bright and then is cut hard, the silence that follows not emptiness but a live wire. Footsteps on wooden floors speak in a register close to a heartbeat. Cane chairs complain when weight settles into them. A small drip from a broken eave keeps time until a sparrow enters shot and interrupts it, establishing that nature has the right to improvise. The score refuses to cheapen the sparrow with flutes. It simply lets the sound of the bird's claws on wood scratch at your comfort. When an unseen door somewhere in the house closes, the low drum you weren't conscious of becomes visible, like a figure stepping out of a shadow with a familiar coat on. Lin Wuya's face is not a canvas, it's a locked room where you think you see a window and it turns out to be a mirror. The actor trusts stillness the way most men trust force. When the first queen, the one whose hair caught firelight, asks nothing aloud and yet dares him to speak, his jaw shifts, but not in defiance. It's the movement of discomfort in the presence of someone who has known you longer than your own narrative about yourself. He attempts humor and abandons it mid-breath. He reaches for hard certainty and finds it missing. His tongue wets a lower lip that has never needed help. That small failure is the spark of the film's emotional engine, a god of war who finds war easy and conversation a blade without a handle. What separates Satu Dewa Perang, Tujuh Ratu from the ritual clichés of blood and righteousness is that its violence is never a performance for the audience, it's an argument between forms of love. Tightly framed practice sparring in a courtyard glistening from rain does not lead to roaring catharsis. It reveals that Lin Wuya strikes a fraction too late in every exchange with the second queen, as if unwilling to trespass on a space where he is already welcome. His blade wants speed, his heart does not. She corrects him not with scolding but with footwork, forcing him into rhythms he can't own. You can see the moment he wishes to be less dangerous just to be more comprehensible to her. The camera watches his ankles. Mastery is humility's jacket turned inside out. The massacre of his family wears no gore in this telling, it wears a color story. Flashback invades present tense not with bells or fog filters but with the cold of a covered sun, a shift from jade to the gray of unripe pearls. The rooms from earlier names take on new weather. We are not shown throats. We are shown bowls cooling on a table, steam stuttering, the pattern of a glaze holding the memory of a hand that will not lift it again. A plum bruises under its own weight. Sound gets thinner, like a pencil worn down to wood. In the corner of one frame, A small kite made by a child trembles on its string even though there is no wind at all. The editing leaves sentences hanging. We do not see a body fall, but we hear a cup find the ground and stay there. The power of withholding is not a tease, it's respect. Because Lin Wuya returns to what was taken from him, the film must answer, what does return do to a man who never left the war that took everything in the first place? That question hums through the visuals like a tuning fork. He moves through familiar rooms like a ghost too polite to commit to haunting. Every threshold is a decision he postpones until only thresholds remain. The camera frames him between pillars in a way that makes him look like a votive offering, someone left at the mercy of a shrine instead of in charge of one. If he is king of the underworld, he is also its youngest and most reluctant subject. The paradox runs hot. Power has made him paradoxically porous, able to be stained by memory more easily than the less powerful who simply fall asleep at the mercy of forgetting. Each queen is a mirror he resents and needs. The film is unsentimental about female sanctity, it paints these women with the same ambivalence it grants its god of war. One carries a scar over a collarbone that calls attention not to injury but to stubbornness, another ignores ceremony, sits with knees apart, and hums tunelessly when she concentrates, an act of survival that offends no one except men who mistake reverence for good manners. They are not archetypes. They are topographies. You map them by weather and terrain rather than role. Their authority emerges from competence so familiar it has become a style. When they speak to Lin Wuya, they do not lower their volume to suit his appetite for heroism, they expect him to own his appetite like a craftsman cares for a blade, sharpen often, use carefully, put away clean. Notice how the film introduces one queen through refusal. We only hear her, never see her face fully for a long run of minutes. She corrects a young novice's grip on a broom, explains the angle of wrist needed to guide a flood of fallen petals into a coherent pile, and in that act of instruction reveals more about her notion of order than any speech might. Order to her is not stacking stone. It is aligning chaos to a current that does not drown the delicate. When the eventual close-up arrives, it does so as a courtesy we have earned with patience. The lens eats her features with a hunger sugarless and clean, fine lines like wings held closed, eyes no longer bright but more honest for their dimming, the kind of mouth that knows precisely how to hurt a tyrant. She smiles only at work done properly. Music threads itself through all of this without announcing a theme, and yet the mind cannot help mapping two, one for Lin Wuya, one for the women. His is a two-note phrase with a drum between, the notes almost but not quite neighbors, as if he is forever just missing a step he wants to take. There's a shimmer layered upon shimmer, metallophone teeth gliding over each other like light over water, pattern that seems random until the ear leans in and recognizes that we are not hearing melody, we are hearing time kept like a hand held steadily under a fevered brow. When both patterns meet, not melded but layered, you feel the fiction we tell about the self softening. He is not diminished by the accompanying presence, he is distributed. The mix is careful here, the bass breath of his drums lives under the jangle of their chimes, the way steadiness lives under agitation when a house full of opinion is talking loudly but acting with the same purpose. An early set piece offers combat as grammar. Instead of cutting quickly for excitement, the film divorces action from speed and insists that motion exists inside a clause. Two fighters encapsulate meanings inside a shot, arc, halt, mild return, inhale. We watch them correct their own sentences mid-flight, a sword that began like an accusation ends as a question, the answer is not steel but a pivot that refuses the frame's premise. The camera does not show off. It takes its time learning how to earn trust. Slow push ins. Retreats that never turn their back. The choreography lacks flourish the way good arguments lack shouting. Strikes land, no one gurgles. The best exchange ends when a shoulder relaxes. The kill is sometimes mercy. We suspect that both those words mean the same thing here. And then a scene so quiet it might be mistaken for filler becomes the fulcrum for everything. Lin Wuya sits alone in a room, not the grand hall with ancestral faces but a small side chamber where a mirror has survived with a crack through it like a river. He stares not at himself but at the crack until his own face is just a shape around its fault. In the background a queen folds paper long strips, precise, uninterested in his drama, she gives him the dignity of not noticing him disintegrate. His posture collapses not into sobbing but into a failure to keep his shoulders square. It's humiliating in a way few scenes about male grief allow you to feel. There is no nobility in this surrender, just accuracy. He tries to speak, finds breath insufficient, and instead recites a section of a poem we have not heard before, voice getting the meter wrong, words falling out of order. The effect is not embarrassment. It is the opposite. This is what it looks like when a man stops acting as if grief is an instrument he is skilled at playing. The political undercurrent arrives sly, through architecture. We are taken to a palace of power that claims to be legitimate, and the geometry betrays it. Lines do not meet properly. Stairs rise at a punishing pitch as if designed to humiliate knees. Corridors curve not to delight but to disrupt sight lines. The set tells you without moralizing that this is a place built by people who mistrust the human back. In this palace our antagonists, including forces masquerading as guardians of order, speak in the language of logic diagrams. They capture nuance and kill it on arrival. The casting of their leader is particularly shrewd, a soft voice capable of violence not out of appetite but out of habit, a smile that reads like a threat even when sincere. When later a queen calls him a bureaucrat of terror, the line lands not because it is clever, but because the film has already taught us what his hallways feel like. Bad men in good films are often overdrawn. Here he is drawn precisely to scale, banal and inevitable, a man who thinks a ledger can purify a bowl of poisoned rice. When Lin Wuya confronts a lower official complicit in his family's erasure, the staging avoids the trap of righteousness. The scene takes place in a wet market, mid-morning, the crush of bodies softened by umbrellas, the air embarrassing itself with good smells, stewed broth, charred scallion, durian defying opinion. Noise floats like a crown. No one notices gods or destiny or vengeance, they are all too well fed with tasks. The camera hides behind hanging duck bodies as if ashamed to intrude. The official tries to continue haggling, eyes sliding away, until Lin Wuya says a name too quietly for the microphones to catch at first. Heads turn in a ripple. The score goes silent. Rain ticks on a tin roof then hiccups, as if someone held a breath and the weather obeyed. It's the most adult depiction of power I've seen in a while, not a roar, not the raising of a hand, but the alignment of the present to a truth that has been waiting under a table like a dog that knows it will be fed eventually. The psychology of Lin Wuya's origin threads like a rumor through every angle on his face. The phrase, king of the underworld, is allowed to function as symbol more than wound. It is not literal geography but moral jurisdiction. He does not rule the dead, he is the sovereign of what we do not say. He curates silence like a museum collects objects that survive fires. We watch him excuse cruelty in himself too easily because it feels clinical, not sadistic. We also watch him commit to small kindnesses as if they might bribe fate into giving him back what it cannot. In one scene a child spills ink over a calligraphy mat and breaks into the particular audible panic of a child who expects punishment. Lin Wuya kneels, takes the child's wrist gently, and moves his hand through the ink, drawing a better character out of the stain. He says nothing. He is instructing himself to stop expecting doom. Pay attention to how the queens handle him. They do not indulge the romance of taming a monster. They don't feed his myth. They require work instead. Sweep this courtyard, hold that stance, repair the hinge you keep walking past as if it is someone else's problem. One queen laughs when he suggests a plan to draw the enemy into an ambush, not because it's foolish but because it's boring. You always want thunder, she says without looking at him, but thunder cannot sign a birth record. The line comes like a cracked bead of glass, sharp, small, cutting only the necessary. He takes the correction with the expression of a scholar who has miscopied a line and plans to stay after class. Bullets and blades are less interesting to the film than etiquette, truth that gives its action weight when it finally arrives. There is a training passage with a rhythm so specific it feels scored by breath alone. Early morning, mist negotiating terms with the lake, a platform of bamboo slick and a little treacherous. Lin Wuya stands at the edge, sword at rest, feet making friends with the idea of falling. One queen walks out with a staff the length of a mistake she once made and intends never to repeat. She jabs the platform's planks, not at him but at the structure itself, setting the surface quivering so his balance has to learn humility. He leans too hard on sight, she forces him to feel the tremors running up through his soles. Without a word, the lesson is given: the world will never stop wobbling for your convenience. The camera drops to feet, to toes gripping fiber, to nails untrimmed catching and letting go. Sound reduces to breath and the reed hum of insects. At the cut, you hear the slightest laugh. It might be the lake. The film's philosophy lands in the interlacing of gesture and patience. It is suspicious of mantles. God of War is a costume that costs more than it pays, hunger disguised as a virtue. But it is also aware that titles are local spells. They make rooms behave, they pull attention to where it can serve the good, they protect the fragile while the strong gather their courage. The point is not to reject power but to interrogate its favorite lies. Over and over we see Lin Wuya decide to step backward so someone else can speak, and over we feel the tug of his old habits almost reclaiming him. The queens recognize when he is about to lie to himself and stop him with the cleanest interventions. A hand on an elbow when an outburst would buy easy catharsis. A raised eyebrow just before cruelty can pretend to be efficiency. He is not reformed. He is re-educated. Editing gives us time to metabolize change. Fades feel less like transitions and more like blinked understanding. Cuts often land on the exhale, rarely on impact, so even violence arrives as a next sentence rather than an extinguishing flame. There are sequences where the sound of a knife entering flesh never plays, instead we hear a pot lid settle on a boil. The quiet is a constant admonition: this is not spectacle, this is life continuing, whether or not your story has found a neat shape. The mid-film council offers a masterclass in ensemble blocking. 7 women arranged not symmetrically but rhythmically, a low diagonal that creates a slope of power rather than a wall of it. Lin Wuya sits lower than them by half a step, not a humiliation, a vantage. He can see each profile, can witness the way the oldest among them refuses to give the camera her best side, chooses instead the angle that shows the scar left by some long-ago surgery we will never hear about. The light is unkind to no one. It reveals and forgives in the same act. Dialogue is minimal but pointed. Someone mentions the word origin, and the room chills in a way that no set of wind chimes can fake. Every woman has her own notion of what the word means. In the silence that follows, we are forced to pick one, or to admit we have been using the word wrong our whole lives. In a smaller film this would be a tale of vengeance with flourishes. Here it becomes a dissertation on birth, chosen, accidental, engineered, discovered late, rewritten with love. Rumors thread the market scenes. Some say Lin Wuya was born in a flood. Others say he was assembled the way a blade is, folds upon folds of tempering, nothing natural about the result except its usefulness. A rumor with silk teeth claims he was not born at all but appointed by animosity, a vacancy in a system that required someone to carry a grief heavier than community could collectively tolerate. The queens do not correct the rumors, they let them live, because a community's lies are often what hold it together until courage arrives. Filmmaking here is anthropology as much as narrative. It cares about belief as a social organ, not as a plot coupon. The sequence that hurt me most arrives without a warning label: Lin Wuya in a kitchen with the 4th queen, the one who makes broth. She salts a pot with a pinch that flies like snow. He asks her a question without words by taking the ladle from her hand. She refuses to answer with words by forcing him to taste first. He sips and blinks once. The broth is wrong but the lesson is right. Impatience ruins what time would mend. She tells him he must allow a bitterness at the beginning so sweetness can mean something later. He nods, embarrassed by what he needs to hear. She smiles at the pot, not him. If cinema had more of this, it would need fewer murders. There is a villain in this tapestry, but he exists less as a man and more as an inevitable function. He is that part of a system that hates ambiguity because ambiguity refuses invoices. He has a long forehead and cheeks like paper that never met rain. When he laughs, it is mostly an exhale. He has a habit of smoothing his hair when lying and of confessing small falsehoods to build the habit of not trusting himself. His court is efficient. His servants do not fear him, they fear the idea of being turned into a servant so obedient they no longer possess even a taste for defiance. Efficiency is the god worshipped here, and this film treats efficiency as a demon whose gifts burn the house down slowly. Lin Wuya and the queens do not outfight him in the most meaningful sense. They outlast his definitions. Cinematography continues to speak where words cannot. Locations are mapped by texture. The archive where a secret might hide has air that tastes like a metal bowl left in the sun, paper yellower than caution, dust motes with private orbits. The camera here moves at half speed, as if librarians taught it manners. The ink of old records gleams with oil like fish caught too late. A brush hair is trapped in the corner of a scroll, human error turned relic. Lin Wuya moves through this space with a slight stoop, as if tall men should not loom over memory. His fingertips, usually so sure, hover before touching a page. And when he does touch, the sound designer gives us the whisper of calligraphy speaking up for the first time in years. It's an earned magic, not CGI but craft that knows which frequencies hum the loudest in our bones. The action scenes that puncture the later movements of the film come soaked in etiquette they cannot suppress. There's a fight in a bamboo grove at dusk where the camera refuses to show us more than 2 blades at a time, training our brains to look for cause and effect rather than fireworks. Bamboo bends out of courtesy when a body flies too close. Sound turns percussion into argument, the crack of cane, the breath of a body fleeing its own axis, the tiny applause of leaves disturbed and then settling with the embarrassed dignity of witnesses who know violence is sometimes a kind of literacy forced on the unwilling. Blood appears only when it has a sentence to finish. I watched Knuckles brush knuckles and learned more about trust than in 10 sermons. He learns to be protected. That's the point. This god of war carries the grace to be sheltered, and the camera keeps proving it by stepping behind him when the queens are near, seeing the world through his borrowed safety. In one passage he kneels on a rush mat while a queen applies herbs to a formidable bruise new to even his familiar torso. Her hands never hesitate but do slow at the edge of a scar old enough to be a relative. She places one palm flat on it, not to heal or to bless, but to say, "This belongs." He flinches just enough to confess an old fear he has never named. She ignores the flinch the way a mother ignores a tantrum that has stopped being clever. He exhales. A ceiling fan somewhere stutters, a sound like a small flag learning wind. The world, like him, learns a new consent. Somewhere discreet, an oracle who does not believe in the supernatural reads a map of veins in his wrist and laughs without joy. She tells him the thing he feared less than the truth, that his origin was curated, that men and women with clean hands and dirty thoughts chose attributes the way they choose ink stones, blending hardness and polish to create a signature. He was to be the courthouse where grief received its stamp. A practical horror. He pulls back his hand, not out of disgust, but out of the realization that free will costs a higher tax than pride pays willingly. We hear no strings here, no groan from the orchestra, just the scrape of a stool on stone as she returns to work because revelation makes poor soup. Is the underworld literal? The film lets it be a place once, and the choice is memorable, a cave that glows with water's patience, walls slick with a sheen like animal eyes at night, a ceiling hung low enough that even the small must bow. Torches burn with as little ceremony as a kitchen candle. Shadows behave like handwriting in the hands of a tired man, legible but unlovely. In this grave of light he relives not the massacre but a moment earlier than all that, a night when he was born into anger and it felt like home. The dead are not there despite the set dressing. He is there, and that's enough. He takes a step forward and finds no ground. The camera holds 3 beats too long on his toes, setting terms with air. He doesn't fall. That's the miracle. No music congratulates him. We can register the shift in his spine. He stops trying to prove that he deserves the attention pain pays. He begins instead to fund small economies of trust. The queens notice first not because they are watching him like hawks but because they are not watching him at all. They are busy. He fails and they ignore the performance of it. He succeeds and they ignore the noise of it. He asks about their day and they shrug, which in this language translates to, "Thank you for asking." The drama deflates into reality and becomes braver for it. Even his most elegant strike now tastes of conversation rather than verdict. The god of war keeps his title. He wears it less like a throne and more like a coat you put on to go outside so the wind doesn't sting unnecessarily. A festival erupts in the city almost by accident, color popping like seeds in hot oil, crimson pennants, lanterns with bellies full of sunrise, women painting each other's wrists with dye that will last until memory does not. Lin Wuya moves through it like a reef under a bright ocean. He does not disturb the fish, he allows them to discover him. A queen next to him eats something messy, smiles with purple teeth, refuses to conform to dignity's predictable appetite, and he smiles at that, a small science experiment whose conclusion is, joy is possible with equal chances of success as failure. The score warms. Strings that had lived under the floorboards rise into the main room. The film does not sentimentalize the moment, it uses it as proof of ethical theory. If we cannot dance while we plan the revolution, then the revolution has already hopped the wrong train. The massacre's answer, the conspiracy's name, the map that betrays origin for what it is, these arrive as byproducts of the life we've been watching stitched together with needle and time. There is an investigation, but we are spared corkboards covered in red string. The queens recall details years old not because they are scholars but because care allows memory to function beyond self. A tune hummed under a breath in the first act reappears as a full song at a bathhouse where steam bruises the camera's lens. A character we dismissed as comic relief reveals he notices which smells travel on which winds, and from that deduction a warehouse burns at the exact hour it would be least crowded. The film trusts us to applaud the systems that make justice small enough to hold. When Nightmare finally arrives in human clothing, it does not twirl. It asks polite questions. The villain's emissaries attend a ritual, bow correctly, and still everything in you wants to pull the queens out of the room and let the roof cave in on the rest. Tension here refuses cheap sale. It grows like roots through concrete, pressure building under what's supposed to be smooth. Someone wipes a drop of tea from a table slowly enough to read as menace. A sleeve hides a blade insufficient to kill a queen but perfectly crafted to nick a god, fitting, since gods bleed not like we do. The scene's best cut is to the underside of the table where four knees respond to stress differently, bounce, freeze, flex, slide. We learn a taxonomy of survival. The confrontation that follows occurs at the hinge point of a storm. Rain begins as joke and turns to doctrine. Lin Wuya and two queens step into a yard tiled for formality, water skipping off pottery, the light skin to the bone. Opponents advance from under the eaves, shoes betraying discipline by making no sound at all. The camera goes shoulder height, refusing to grant the gods their usual crane. Every move is documented with the fairness that tells you the filmmakers love neither winner nor loser more than the truth of impact. Lightning, when it arrives, is not punctuation but glare, people squint, which feels like a secret we haven't earned in action cinema, heroes have eyes. Blades clack. Staffs punch water. At one heart-stopping instant a queen missteps not because the script needed suspense but because she is mortal and slippery with rain. Lin Wuya is too far to catch her. And yet she does not fall, another queen's hand is where it needed to be. The choreography makes a straightforward argument, reliance is not failure, it is strategy. A breath, and then the cut to quiet. After the storm a room glows with candlelight that does not flatter anyone, and thank God. Capacities are exhausted. There is shaking that no one calls shaking. A cup is placed on the table exactly where an absent friend always put it and no one mentions the act of kindness because to praise it would be to turn care into performance. The floor creaks. We know the house is old, but the sound is a new dictionary, fatigue translated into the language of wood. The camera does not hover for pity. It behaves like a neighbor who knows when to pretend not to hear crying through thin walls. It is in this softened, post-battle air that the oldest queen decides to unfurl a sliver of the particular wound she's been sheathing behind good posture for hours and also years. She stands, though she does not have to, so the confession cannot be mistaken for a plea. Lin Wuya remains seated, the film refusing to stack his height against her authority. She removes from a hanging sleeve a strip of silk stained a color that remembers accident. That stain, she says, is the only true origin any of us ever get. We collide with something we did not predict and we make a new map. She hands him the silk, which is lighter than expected, lighter than it should be for the weight it thinks it carries. He takes it like one would hold a bird not quite dead. His face doesn't crumble. It resettles, a small landslide somewhere no one has built houses. Outside, the last of the storm peels itself off the sky, like a shirt after a long day. There is a knock at the door that no one was expecting. The sound is a polite fist on wood, but it lands with the gravity of handwriting you recognize even if you don't know why. The door slides open a measure, the line between inside and outside no longer theatrical, just a blade of dark air moving through light. A figure stands there, silhouette carved by lantern bloom, nothing dramatic in the posture except the refusal to wet the threshold by stepping in with damp shoes. The Queen's turn without fear, which is its own kind of omen. The figure waits for the right to speak. Lin Wuya lifts his hand in invitation that feels less like power and more like hospitality's memory returned. The figure says his name in a tone that does not belong to a stranger. He hates how his heart answers first, like a bell mistaken for a throat. The candle nearest the door gutters once, twice. It does not stride in, it permits itself to appear, and in that permission the room bows, the way wheat bends for a wind that is less a force than a recognition. The silhouette breaks into gradations, hem first, then the soft clatter of a bead against another bead, then a line at the jaw as if carved by a chisel that once cut commandments in stone. You learn a lifetime before the face declares itself. The gait carries a remembered injury the scene never names. A long ago misstep has trained this body to distribute weight like an argument that starts where it intends to end. Leather learns the flaw. Threads remember a hand that stitched in a hurry and then went back to correct the haste. Even the air feels not breathed but inherited. Light risks an intimacy it has resisted so far. A candle on the far table dims by a shade that reads like modesty. The lantern closest takes on the labor of testimony, and from its mouth spills a leaf of gold that clings to cheekbones with the bias of favoritism. Wuya turns, a half-turn, the most ethical of pivots, neither invitation nor rebuke, and in that slight reorientation the film locates its bravest resource, the refusal to declare whether this approach is balm or blade. His shoulder does a thing you will miss if you watch only with eyes, the scapula slides 1/8 of an inch, emotion soldiers learn to hide and sons never do. The mouth stays closed, the tongue rides the roof of the mouth as if language would otherwise break loose. In his eyes, 1,000 winter mornings that taught him to rise not because dawn asked, but because silence does. The Queens do not flinch. Rearrangement occurs first in breath, then in ankle, only finally in gaze. They do not rush to pause. They narrow the aperture of the room, draw its circumference tighter as if to keep a draft from prying under skin. One queen angles her body to offer a sight line and with that selfless geometry declares allegiance, neither to man nor mystery, but to the integrity of unfolding. Another lowers her chin a degree, which in her grammar means, I will not interrupt, and in the room's translations reads as law. The youngest, a promise wearing composure like a novice wears formal attire, situates herself just off axis, balancing tension's fulcrum so it does not tip into panic. Sound slips its hand into script without asking. A length of fabric strokes another by accident, a sigh of cloth that used to live on a loom and hasn't forgotten the rhythm. The faintest collision of wood against wood, a cane, a scabbard, a mistake, reverberates as if the walls have been waiting decades for it to happen again. Somewhere an unseen kettle almost thinks about boiling, the micro wine calls to your teeth. Scent thickens, camphor folded into old paper, the astringency of oiled steel kept clean more by habit than by use, a fragile sweetness of something medicinal that could be poultice or perfume depending on who names it. Architecture, older than confession, leans on its joints and decides not to creak. Memory does not arrive as image, it comes as texture. This is a film that distrusts the obvious generosity of flashback. Instead of showing you what happened, it shows you what happening's made of surfaces. The newcomer's sleeve carries a faint mottling that echoes the discoloration on a portrait frame Wuya studied earlier, a marriage of stains negotiated by time. On his hand rides a ring scratched in the configuration of a spiral you saw once on a tile and then on steam and then on the curve of choice itself. The design lands now like a verdict. The lullaby that wound its way into air gives up melody to cadence, slipping into a lower scale the way water seeks depth when gravity starts dictating mood. You do not hear words so much as the impression that words used to be here and left fingerprints on breath. The camera doesn't lunge for faces. It holds where anticipating lives, on thresholds, on the space a step will soon occupy, on the sliver of distance between two palms that could, if they were improvident, become bridge or strike. A pane of rice paper intervenes long enough to slice an image into shadow script, calligraphy painted by bodies with no brush but the urge to be seen or not. Through that membrane, light makes characters of everyone, dignifying edges. The silhouette's nose becomes a prelude, the line of a cheek retracts slightly as if to reconsider its own existence. We are made to read these people as ideograms, and in learning to read them, learn to read ourselves. Power in this room adopts the vocabulary of posture. The newcomer declines height not by stooping, it would be theatrical, but by allowing his chin to withdraw a finger's width, moving his gaze from horizon to human. Wuya doesn't stand taller, he redistributes his gravity so that his soles occupy the floor not as claim, but as consent to remain. A queen lifts one foot and plants it again with the care of a judge striking but not smashing. Another queen slides her hands forward on a table until only her nails are visible, the slightest crescents catching what light there is. Crescents are moons and moons are cycles and cycles are warnings. The smallest of them all tilts her ear toward the sound of the breath between sentences, because in some languages breath confesses long before grammar can. What is a father in a world where lineage is both chain and rope? The film does not settle for paternity as biology or mysticism, it asks whether the shape of our origins lies inside our capacity to name those who showed us how to stand without collapsing. Leadership, it suggests, is not crown but debt you never finish paying and would be dishonorable to discharge. If the newcomer is origin, he is also liability. If he is threat, he is also teacher, because fear instructs. Satu Dewa Perang, Tujuh Ratu distrusts the sentimental seduction of reunion, it knows the gravest homecomings are those that return to collect interest on old promises. A queen who keeps joy like a pilot light tends to the kettle without moving from her post. She does not pour in a rush. Hot water learns curve, crawls across porcelain in a sheet-like silk train to obey a shoulder. Tea leaves unfurl as if they were manuscripts thawing after winter, releasing notes, hay, smoke, a rumor of fruit, this room has earned. She slides one cup toward Wuya and parks another before the silhouette, distance preserved, heat shared. A third cup waits nearest the reader of silences, steam rising like question marks that refuse to stand straight. In this choreography, hospitality is not truce but test, who will touch what scalds, and what will that touch make of them? You expect betrayal to announce itself with symbols because cinema trained you lazily. Here it slips in as a vowel softened beyond recognition. The first word the silhouette spends is competent at belonging to two languages, maybe three, the consonants worn where other mouths have worried them. The cane, if cane it is, finds the floor and leaves a bruise in the soundscape big enough to lay your ear in. You do not see everything. There is the mercy. The film permits your imagination to finish what the frame refuses to complete. It knows that your own private compilations of loss are more terrifying than whatever could be staged. Outside, life refuses to suspend itself for a man's certainty. A vendor tears greens with the rude tenderness of experience. A child keeps a kite aloft not for joy, but from duty. The string has twisted into a knot that will not forgive slackness. Two dogs debate ownership of a smell. Inside, the room's clock is breath, outside, commerce braids breath into barter. The editor crosscuts not to show simultaneity in the cheap sense, but to insist that personal apocalypse is a local weather event. The city will not bow to grief, but it will shade it if you stand still long enough. Color shifts again without spilling into advertisement. The amber leaning on faces deepens to the hue of resin that trapped an insect and called it immortal. Blues at the room's perimeter study indigo until they find it too honest, then settle for shadow that keeps its secrets. White is no longer apology, it's the right to remain unsullied by a history that wants to stain everything. Beyond the door, the sky carries confetti, that ash again, perhaps, or simply a million particles of decision returning to Earth. A bird draws a clean line across this page of air, and for a second you imagine a life that is a line instead of a knot. The film does not indulge you. Somewhere on the table lies a hairpin we thought purely domestic, harmless as ritual. It has length, weight, a point blunted by years of negotiating with snarls. The camera respects it the way it respects all tools. It catches a shy glint as if to propose new vocation. But hands on a restraint. The queen who once set it down does not reach for it. She wills it to be ornament even as the room asks it to be instrument. In that resistance the film composes a thesis on nonviolence with more courage than any speech in a war court. Breath behaves like weather systems colliding. One set of lungs releases air low and slow, trained by rooms where silence must not be startled. Another holds air higher, clavicles participating, the tell of someone who learned to stay calm by pretending. Beneath this duet, the room exudes its own exhale, wood off-gassing the heat it hoarded, floorboards warming at the heel's insistence. Foley becomes confession. A toe brushes grit across stone, the grains counting themselves back into place. The ear reads maps the eye ignores. Time fractures briefly into craft. 3 frames flash by, could be mistake, could be genius, the quick soft shape of a child's heel dirty with play, a clump of reeds bent to a foot's measure, the undersurface of a table carved with an initial older than its carver. The past refuses montage, it prefers fugue. Echo and subject weave until you cannot tell who is repeating whom. The film demands patience. Patience pays in meaning instead of adrenaline. Voice arrives at last, not to answer questions, but to deposit a riddle like a letter that knows it will be read in the wrong season. The timbre surprises. It is not paternal in the cliché of warmth baked into command, it's a ribbon of sand in water, a texture you feel on the tongue even as you attempt to swallow it nicely. Sibilants drag slightly as if scar tissue skims the consonant. Stops land with the careful satisfaction of coins tapped on a table to check for counterfeit. If this is love, it is the love that learned to wear armor beneath the shirt. If this is hatred, it is hatred tired of performing bravado, showing up uncombed but punctual. Paper, freshly disciplined into order by an earlier sequence, makes a new argument under this voice. A ledger at the edge of vision exhales at the weight of absence. A thin seam on a scroll lifts from its glued allegiance to wood. For a whisper of seconds you see what law is when humans leave, fiber, paste, dried plant insisting on being thought. Somewhere in the underworld's archive a page spontaneously rearranges itself because the sentence it meant to fix in place has escaped into breath. The image does not show this, but you know it because the room reads like paper around a candle, edges warm with anticipation of turning. The queens carry their storms inward. The listener of subtleties tucks a strand of hair behind an ear with the care of someone sealing a note. Her earlobe blushes, an autonomic confession she cannot prevent. The oldest allows her shoulders to drop an atom's width, the truest relief she will ever let witnesses have. The one who never sits, but in a chair too low to flatter, affirming that proximity outranks dignity when the floor requests co-conspiracy. Nails, clean, blunt, unpainted, press half-moons into palm. One of them leaks the tiniest crescent of pink again when pressure relaxes, a sign that fear has not killed circulation. No one issues edicts. Stillness levies its test as if the room had been waiting years to proctor it. The newcomer, 2 paces inside, does not close the door. Leaving things ajar is a philosophy, exits must always be architecture, not decision. Ouya occupies the exact center not of the room, but of a geometry you feel more than see. 3 queens on the north-south, 2 anchoring the diagonal, 1 at east watching shadows conduct their workshop, 1 at west telling air how to behave. He must cross nobody and everybody at once. Choice becomes a map the feet must draw. When he moves, it is almost not movement. The right foot swings a measured arc, a circle so slight a draftsman would call it error and a dancer would call it prayer. His knee does not lock, because men who lock joints break. His hand lifts and hangs the way a lantern hangs on a nail that will not consent to go any deeper. The newcomer's head inclines enough to allow breath into the other lung. Eyes, so much ink they could have been poured, trace a line not to Ouya's face, but to his sternum, where truth lives and where lies drown. The bell beyond tires of both of them and stops. Distance thins. Meaning gets heavy. Some part of the city remembers thunder and threatens to import it. A child's laugh outside tries to pierce the room and fails, the sound dies on lattice, unable to find purchase, and the silence that follows sits like a hand on a table waiting to be claimed. The film refuses to cut. Seconds are allowed to become atmosphere. Your body realizes it has been pretending to breathe and starts again with small, obedient inhales, as if to avoid attention. He could speak first. He does not. The newcomer could lift a hand and take all the power available to gesture. He declines. A queen could stand and intervene, rewriting the scene with matriarchal grammar that would erase masculine theatrics. She withholds. The hairpin on the table admits it could solve nothing by becoming momentary weaponry and commits again to irrelevance, the most difficult art. Heat rises from cups thoroughly but privately. Steam declines to cloud anyone's face, either out of respect or out of fear of being drafted to choose sides. When the word finally breaks the surface, it is not a name. It is a title nobody asked for, the sort people utter when they want history to do their dirty work. It lands wrong on Wu Ya's bones and right on the ones who believe order is a god. His pupils widen a hair. A muscle behind his jaw, Masita, reliable servant, registers its vote and returns to waiting. He resists looking to the oldest queen because he refuses to seek shelter from a storm he believes he must stand in to become useful. The newcomer breathes as if air tastes like a thing he used to own. There is a window in this room that we have not yet earned. It is small and set too high to look through, designed for light more than for gaze. In the fraction of a second where everything else becomes background, that window becomes a stage where a moth flutters against glass in the pattern of someone trying to remember a song. You might not notice it, but your skin does. It knows the signature of trapped things. Wu Ya's hand tightens into something nearly a fist and then reconsiders. Small miracles hide in rescinded violence. The film's score, which has been practicing humility, allows itself the barest thread of human voice, no words, a vowel so faint it could be hinge squeak or dream. It holds, and as it holds, your body becomes instrument, you feel the note in your teeth, your jaw going mercifully soft. The newcomer closes his eyes not to withdraw, but to retrieve. When he opens them, the irises seem a degree lighter, a trick of light or decision. He is about to choose the key he will pitch the room in for the next hour, and with it, who in this story will survive their own convictions. At the edge of the frame a hand you have not tracked reaches toward the cup meant for the silhouette. The hand is quick and gentle, a paradox anyone who has tended babies or widows understands. It lifts the cup a finger high and sets it down again, a shift no plot can justify and all ethics can, announcing warmth without conceding intimacy. Wu Ya's gaze breaks, just then, just enough, to recognize the labor of care being risked on his behalf. Pride pats its pockets for the knife and comes up empty. He lets the gratitude remain unperformed. The newcomer inhales for speech. The queens hold their ground like the border between history and possibility. The room itself waits, not religious, not superstitious, but practical in its alchemy of wood and air and time, all its molecules aligned to record what comes next without bias. His tongue starts a consonant that asks the mouth to open wide and the heart to follow, an incipient syllable with old dust on it, and in that smallest fraction where sound has promise but not yet body, a ripple passes across Wu Ya's face, shock crossing tenderness, terror meeting recognition, and the candle beside them gutters, snatching a breath it cannot afford to keep. Dies, not with drama but with relief, as if the wick could no longer bear witness and chose mercy over endurance. Shadow eats the edge of the room until faces become interpretations, and still the figure waits, wet shoes aligned neatly beyond the threshold like apologies. What enters next is not a man in the sense of threat but in the sense of consequence. He brings with him the smell of damp rice sacks and old ink, and a posture that has been careful too long. The lens glides sideways to find his hands first, fingertips stained the color of dried plum where ink refuses to leave, a callus in the web between thumb and forefinger that betrays a life of pressing brushes into sentences. When he bows, he does not lower his head, he lowers his gaze, conceding judgment without surrendering spine. It's a protocol that tells you everything about obedience as a habit and regret as a job. No one speaks quickly. The room's etiquette makes haste feel vulgar. The oldest queen tilts her head the width of a hair, and only then does the man permit his voice to enter the air. It's the sound paper would make if paper could apologize. He says Lin Wu Ya's name not as one says a prayer or a challenge but as one says a word they have written so often the letters live in their tendons. Lin's eyes do not widen. They deepen. The skin at the bridge of his nose smooths out, a private denial abandoned. He does not reach for a weapon or a verdict. He adjusts the fold of the silk he is holding as if to prevent a crease from becoming a habit. The camera practices the same discipline, no zoom, only a patient push the distance of a breath until we can read the texture of fabric held between forefinger and thumb. The confession arrives with the slow courage of someone who has held onto a shard for so long it has fused to the bone. He does not say, "Forgive me," because the film has no patience for transaction in the grammar of remorse. Instead, the ink on the registry page 30 years ago bears a stroke that should not be there, a hairline flourish that transformed a given name into a function. He changed a character at the behest of people whose cleanliness always had receipts. He did it for a reason that won no arguments, to keep a woman alive who was not strong enough to bury him. He did not know that such a small favor to fear would recruit a child into a lifetime of weather meant for buildings, not for ribs. He learned too late. The rest of his life has been the arithmetic of late learning. Everything tightens and nothing moves. One queen's left hand closes around the edge of the table and then opens again, tendons lifting like strings under a musician's fingers. Another sits even smaller, as if her body understood before her mind did that being larger would accomplish nothing. Lin Wuya's mouth gathers at one corner someplace between a smirk and bile, but the expression never commits because he refuses to insult the dead with performance. He asks the only question that matters and does it without sound: was I chosen or made? The man answers with a look at the floorboards that does not travel to anyone's eyes. Both, the room decides, and neither, because this film has never trusted binaries that arrive on time and exactly to size. The director lets the brush do the talking. The old man dips a dry brush into a cup not of ink but of the water that once cooled tea now gone cold. He paints a single mark directly onto the table's sheen, a wet, invisible word that exists only as gloss until the candle's last brother leans his light just right and the stroke glints, then fades. The ephemeral demonstrates what permanence pretends not to know, that the most forceful edits are invisible in the moment, obvious only when desire fails and light changes. Sound falls through itself. The listener's brain begins to hear the shape of the words in the whisper of bristles on wood. The microcosm of craft becomes an ethics lecture disguised as incident. An altered line here, a life bent there, an empire makes room for itself in that bend. Violence fidgets in the room like a child asked to sit still. One queen could end this man with a sharp utensil already in reach. She doesn't. The film delights in this refusal. Not to spare him, but to preserve the gravity of consequence until it has found a better recipient, the machinery that authorized him. She looks at Lin with the eyes of someone who has cleaned up blood before and found it easier, then allows her gaze to land on the man's belt, where a knot has been tied in a hurry. Carelessness where the rest of him is careful. A life out of step with itself. She considers, lowers the weapon she has not yet lifted, and knocks a slice of ginger into a bowl instead, sharpness repurposed. Lin listens like a cliff listens to the sea, accepting the work, acknowledging erosion, reserving the right not to collapse today. His pupils reflect the last incompetent candle as if it has a right to plank itself across grief like a small bridge. When he finally speaks, it is to ask a technical question about ink composition in a particular year of a particular reign. It is a kindness to himself camouflaged as specificity. The man answers poorly, accuracy has been leaving him in increments and tonight he is down to scraps. Another queen, the one who knows archives the way some people know weather, becomes background. That window becomes a stage where a moth flutters against glass in the pattern of someone trying to remember a song. You might not notice it, but your skin does. It knows the signature of trapped things. Wuya's hand tightens into something nearly a fist and then reconsiders. Small miracles hide in rescinded violence. The film's score, which has been practicing humility, allows itself the barest thread of human voice, no words, a vowel so faint it could be hinge squeak or dream. It holds, and as it holds, your body becomes instrument, you feel the note in your teeth, your jaw going mercifully soft. The newcomer closes his eyes not to withdraw, but to retrieve. When he opens them, the irises seem a degree lighter, a trick of light or decision. He is about to choose the key he will pitch the room in for the next hour, and with it, who in this story will survive their own convictions. At the edge of the frame a hand you have not tracked reaches toward the cup meant for the silhouette. The hand is quick and gentle, a paradox anyone who has tended babies or widows understands. It lifts the cup a finger high and sets it down again, a shift no plot can justify and all ethics can, announcing warmth without conceding intimacy. Wuya's gaze breaks, just then, just enough, to recognize the labor of care being risked on his behalf. Pride pats its pockets for the knife and comes up empty. He lets the gratitude remain unperformed. The newcomer inhales for speech. The queens hold their ground like the border between history and possibility. The room itself waits, not religious, not superstitious, but practical in its alchemy of wood and air and time, all its molecules aligned to record what comes next without bias. His tongue starts a consonant that asks the mouth to open wide and the heart to follow, an incipient syllable with old dust on it, and in that smallest fraction where sound has promise but not yet body, a ripple passes across Wuya's face, shock crossing tenderness, terror meeting recognition, and the candle beside them gutters, snatching a breath it cannot afford to keep. Dies, not with drama but with relief, as if the wick could no longer bear witness and chose mercy over endurance. Shadow eats the edge of the room until faces become interpretations, and still the figure waits, wet shoes aligned neatly beyond the threshold like apologies. What enters next is not a man in the sense of threat but in the sense of consequence. He brings with him the smell of damp rice sacks and old ink, and a posture that has been careful too long. The lens glides sideways to find his hands first, fingertips stained the color of dried plum where ink refuses to leave, a callus in the web between thumb and forefinger that betrays a life of pressing brushes into sentences. When he bows, he does not lower his head, he lowers his gaze, conceding judgment without surrendering spine. It's a protocol that tells you everything about obedience as a habit and regret as a job. No one speaks quickly. The room's etiquette makes haste feel vulgar. The oldest queen tilts her head the width of a hair, and only then does the man permit his voice to enter the air. It's the sound paper would make if paper could apologize. He says Lin Wuya's name not as one says a prayer or a challenge but as one says a word they have written so often the letters live in their tendons. Lin's eyes do not widen. They deepen. The skin at the bridge of his nose smooths out, a private denial abandoned. He does not reach for a weapon or a verdict. He adjusts the fold of the silk he is holding as if to prevent a crease from becoming a habit. The camera practices the same discipline, no zoom, only a patient push the distance of a breath until we can read the texture of fabric held between forefinger and thumb. The confession arrives with the slow courage of someone who has held onto a shard for so long it has fused to the bone. He does not say, "Forgive me," because the film has no patience for transaction in the grammar of remorse. Instead, the ink on the registry page 30 years ago bears a stroke that should not be there, a hairline flourish that transformed a given name into a function. He changed a character at the behest of people whose cleanliness always had receipts. He did it for a reason that won no arguments, to keep a woman alive who was not strong enough to bury him. He did not know that such a small favor to fear would recruit a child into a lifetime of weather meant for buildings, not for ribs. He learned too late. The rest of his life has been the arithmetic of late learning. Everything tightens and nothing moves. One queen's left hand closes around the edge of the table and then opens again, tendons lifting like strings under a musician's fingers. Another sits even smaller, as if her body understood before her mind did that being larger would accomplish nothing. Lin Wuya's mouth gathers at one corner someplace between a smirk and bile, but the expression never commits because he refuses to insult the dead with performance. He asks the only question that matters and does it without sound: was I chosen or made? The man answers with a look at the floorboards that does not travel to anyone's eyes. Both, the room decides, and neither, because this film has never trusted binaries that arrive on time and exactly to size. The director lets the brush do the talking. The old man dips a dry brush into a cup not of ink but of the water that once cooled tea now gone cold. He paints a single mark directly onto the table's sheen, a wet, invisible word that exists only as gloss until the candle's last brother leans his light just right and the stroke glints, then fades. The ephemeral demonstrates what permanence pretends not to know, that the most forceful edits are invisible in the moment, obvious only when desire fails and light changes. Sound falls through itself. The listener's brain begins to hear the shape of the words in the whisper of bristles on wood. The microcosm of craft becomes an ethics lecture disguised as incident. An altered line here, a life bent there, an empire makes room for itself in that bend. Violence fidgets in the room like a child asked to sit still. One queen could end this man with a sharp utensil already in reach. She doesn't. The film delights in this refusal. Not to spare him, but to preserve the gravity of consequence until it has found a better recipient, the machinery that authorized him. She looks at Lin with the eyes of someone who has cleaned up blood before and found it easier, then allows her gaze to land on the man's belt, where a knot has been tied in a hurry. Carelessness where the rest of him is careful. A life out of step with itself. She considers, lowers the weapon she has not yet lifted, and knocks a slice of ginger into a bowl instead, sharpness repurposed. Lin listens like a cliff listens to the sea, accepting the work, acknowledging erosion, reserving the right not to collapse today. His pupils reflect the last incompetent candle as if it has a right to plank itself across grief like a small bridge. When he finally speaks, it is to ask a technical question about ink composition in a particular year of a particular reign. It is a kindness to himself camouflaged as specificity. The man answers poorly, accuracy has been leaving him in increments and tonight he is down to scraps. Another queen, the one who knows archives the way some people know weather. Finishes his sentence and corrects his date by a quarter of a year. Her interjection lands gentle enough to be trusted and firm enough to guide the room to where it needs to look next. The scene's power is in how the film trusts quiet labor to resolve what violence would only glamour. They bring out a stack of paper older than anyone there, its edges furred from generations of fingers. The sound it makes uncurling from its own memory conjures moths that do not arrive. A bowl becomes an inkstone. Water takes its old assignment and thickens into confession-colored slurry beneath the work of a grind. The camera refuses close-ups of faces for a rare stretch, it fixes on the ritual of tools. The room begins to behave. Even shame, volatile as oil on a hot pan, settles into something cookable. What follows is not a gotcha and not a hug. It is procedure as prayer. The brush traces the original name in the boy's registry, sharp, clipped, a structure that puts the weight on the final stroke as if to teach perseverance before breakfast. Then it paints the modified version, a soft tail added at the end, an extravagance that transforms functional into fated. The film lets the marks coexist on the wood where they will evaporate, the air briefly becoming gallery. Lin counts the difference with his breath. He doesn't miss the poetry, one unseen stroke, and a boy who might have made boats is made into an answer to questions he did not ask. Acting lives in the small muscles here. The old man's shoulders drop a thumb's width when he realizes he has been allowed to finish writing. A queen's ear twitches a hair before she chooses mercy over policy. Lin's jaw unlocks the way a door does when the person on the other side knocks without entitlement. The camera knows this choreography without feeling the need to annotate it. It absorbs. It shows. It trusts. They do not send the man away. They feed him. His shame eats slowly. He refuses seconds, a mistake that betrays his habit of punishing himself with scarcity. The queen who runs the kitchen frowns without cruelty and slides a dumpling back into his bowl with the authority of someone who knows hunger is a bad teacher. He thanks the food rather than the woman. He leaves with no object in his hands except the lesson of being spared. The door's groove receives the panel with a hiss that sounds too much like a sigh. On his back we see a patch where his robe has been mended twice in the same place with two different threads, indifference in one repair, devotion in the other. The lens lets us love that difference. The camera follows Lin to the courtyard and looks up rather than in, granting night a ceiling of watered silk where stars have instructions we aren't privy to. He stands under it not like a man who wants answers but like a roof testing its beams after a storm. A queen joins him but does not stand beside him. She chooses the stoop, closer to dirt, feet flat to receive the testimony of stone. She tells him a story about a time she altered a student's path by misaligning a stool during an exam, how the boy sat crooked, wrote crooked, and became a better carpenter because the body learns to fix errors it surfaces. She says it awkwardly and that's how we know it's true. He smiles once with his eyes and lets it fade. Two moths argue near the last remaining light, and the argument looks like love to anyone who hasn't been a moth. The investigation that opens in the wake of this unburdening takes place more in palms than in rooms. Hands touch wood where fingers of record-keeping once pressed, reading grain for trauma. Fingertips stain themselves in soot from a ledger house that should not have burned. The score recedes to a tone so low it seems to vibrate the viewer's own ribs rather than the speakers inside the scene. The archive is a place of absence made solid, shelves like ribcages, scrolls like organs removed during a careful autopsy. The cinematography in this space leans toward monochrome without losing the memory of color. An ember hidden in ash glows briefly like a punctuation mark turned shy. Light enters only by permission of cracks. Footsteps agree to be quiet. When Lin lifts a fragment of charred bamboo slip, the flake splits into 2 and then into 6, a script of annihilation that still refuses to disappear. On one side, a faint imprint of a seal, not the glyph we expect to be his, but a neighbor to the one he lives by. A near name that feels like a misspelling of a self. The Queen with the archivist's wrists names the official who liked to borrow seals because he believed the world doesn't need absolutes if the stamp is clean. The way she says his rank shaves ice. A name spoken like a hinge half rusted. They will visit him, not to break him, but to watch him try to hold onto the dignity that refuses to hold onto him. This midpoint tilts the film from grief's private accounting to the public mathematics of manipulation, and it does so without letting its pulse run. The next images are exterior walls with mud slick slapped onto them by poor hands. Children draw lines in dust with burnt stick ends, inventing alphabets that will never be recorded. A queen buys 3 radishes because they are expensive this week and thus honest about the weather. She peels one with a knife that remembers its first owner. The peel falls in a single ribbon and the camera follows it the way a priest watches incense lower itself into a bowl, eyes half closed at the arrogance of smoke. The officer, when cornered in his office that opens onto a courtyard potted with plants maintained by a caretaker who sings off-key, greets them with polite wattage. He believes in the theater of civility as a weapon that does not leave bruises. He makes tea, the equalizer of cowards and heroes in this film, and spills none even when a question arrives like a thrown plate. Lin does not threaten. He mistakes the officer for a man rather than a function, and the film catches the error in a close-up of the man's mouth forming platitudes that have purchased more harm than any knife. It is a masterclass in how the body betrays. The officer moistens his lips when he speaks of fairness, scratches his ear when he promises investigation, arranges empty cups in a circle when he camps inside an excuse. The queens do not perform outrage. One of them asks to see his broom. He is confused. She takes it from his hand and runs a palm over the bristles, finds them slick with oil, decides he hasn't swept in weeks. She hands it back without rebuke. In this moral language, to reveal that someone can no longer maintain their own floor is to reveal the collapse of their claim to order. He flinches and covers the broom with a dossier as if he could hide his loss of housekeeping with paperwork. Lin watches and learns a new definition of victory. Color opens its lungs again in the market that follows. Pigments shout. Bread eats steam. Women in aprons insult each other with delicious alacrity born of affection and proximity. The queens thread through, not as queens but as women with lists. A vendor tries to cheat them, a queen lets him because she's in a hurry. Another circles back later and pays him the difference with an extra coin and a lesson on not practicing poverty on his neighbors. Lin looks for a weapon and finds one in the angle a woman holds her umbrella, protecting a stranger from a drip that would have left a stain on a sleeve. He stores this as if it were a stance he can use in a duel. The letter arrives wrapped in civility. Its paper is quality without ostentation, as if luxury had finally found a way to be quiet about itself. The characters are beautiful in the way a predator can be beautiful when still. Air disrupts its surface with small waves the camera loves too much to ignore. The villain speaks in it in a voice that calls itself contrition. He invites negotiation at a neutral site, a bathhouse that has cleansed better things of worse dirt. The queens read it silently together and together agree to nothing out loud. The film refuses to let us hear their first conclusion. It lets us see the second, preparations without panic, gestures that make spaces honest because honesty will have work to do soon. Bathhouse steam behaves differently depending on who steps into it. The queens transform it into curtain and stage, Lin transforms it into weather. The camera appreciates both crafts. Glass sweats. Wood releases oils inherited from trees that once held birds. We learn more about bodies here than in any fight because water interrogates where we clench. The older queen has toes that curl when she thinks. Another never shuts her eyes underwater, forcing the world to remain accountable. Lin floats once on his back, an indignity he allows because no one of consequence is watching or because everyone of consequence is watching and will testify that a god once admitted to buoyancy. The emissaries arrive weaponless and leave the weapons their smiles can be. A man with a limp that insists on being seen, a woman whose earrings do more talking than she does. The negotiation unfolds with the elegance of a table that has never had to hold dishes it cannot afford. Promises sift themselves into the steam. A clause about amnesty attempts to smuggle a leash through customs. A queen coughs once, a punctuation where flattery tried to end a paragraph. The camera catches the emissary's eye flicking to the exit twice in the span of a sentence and tells us the truth. There is another plan outside this room. When the trap springs, it doesn't start with violence, it starts with geometry. Doors that were meant to slide politely decide to stick. The path out bleeds into a corridor that curves not in wisdom but in conspiracy. Crossbow strings hum out of sight not as threat but as directive, move here, then there, then where we already designed you. The queens do something the film has been training us to recognize as genius, they refuse the route. They drag their wet hems through the puddles they made, turn left where a hallway tries to argue for right, use the building's impatience as map. Sound becomes the ally we didn't know we needed, an echo reveals a chamber's false wall, a convoy of droplets stiffens when air thins. Lin does not charge. He edits the architecture with his body, leans where leaning opens space, straightens where straightening breaks a pattern of expectation. He notices a rope wreathed with inconspicuous tassels, the sort of decoration that assures guests they are safe, and cuts it, and a lattice above drops, blocking a trap they had not yet sprung. Respect sits at the edges of the frame like a dog that understands commands in two languages and obeys in neither until affection is earned. When confrontation is finally unavoidable, he treats the bodies in front of him like questions with many possible answers. He spares a boy whose posture cannot yet bear order, slaps an older man's wrist hard enough to disarm him without turning his bones into prophecy. A queen breaks a nose only after the owner of the nose decides that harm is a form of conversation. She chooses a sentence with a period rather than an exclamation point. There is a moment, blink and you lose a chapter, when Lin grips a man's collar, ink from the registry still smudged on his own fingers from that earlier night, and wipes a line across the man's brow. The gesture reads like a benediction to anyone who hasn't studied war and like a curse to anyone who has. The mark is wetter than blood and will last longer in memory than on skin. Carry this, his silence says, as proof that you were close enough to be spared, and make something of that proximity. The man staggers away, new flag raised on an unworthy forehead. We feel in our own throat the dryness of not shouting when shouting would be delicious. Day fractures into morning as if the sun had to think about it first. The compound breathes in its slower key. Dew lifts a bead at a time from plant spines and leaves nothing sticky behind. Lin finds the hinge the queen asked him to fix weeks ago when he thought a hinge was beneath him and grief a vocation. He kneels. Wood receives his weight with the same absence of comment it offers everyone else. He cleans the screw head with the edge of a sleeve no one will see, aligns the plate to the door with care learned from living in rooms that make behavior easier, and turns the tool slowly enough to hear threads arrange themselves. The squeak that's been voicing its complaint for half the film gives way not to silence but to compatibility. The sound recordist catches his breath matching the last turn. Your chest remembers how to be a chest. This is where the film tells you plainly, in the language of chores, that love is maintenance of what will outlast you. A queen passes, sees him mid-task, and says nothing that could ruin the economy of this moment with praise. She adjusts a pot on a sill so the plant inside will stop leaning toward the wrong light. Their glances are receipts. The wind rifles the hanging laundry, reads their damp edges like a book, and puts it back where it was with the gravity of a librarian. On the terrace where the sills face the city like quiet teeth, two queens survey the laundry as if it were a map. One explains with a finger's path what Lin has not known enough of. They were never only protecting his body, they were insulating his will from a religion of clarity that would have consecrated him into a tool. The commission that raised him wanted a blade that never doubts. The women have been curating doubt as if it were a vitamin. They taught him to ask for the origin of the order, not just the elegance of its arrival. She says this watching a towel drip, authority anchored in attention rather than volume. He hears it and grows taller, exactly the amount that won't make him hit his head on the lintel. If fate is a cage, meaning is its window. The queens show him where the glass is. In the afternoon they take him to a school without children, vacant in that way quiet rooms seem to dream during holidays. Chalk dust has made a permanent cloud of the air. On the blackboard, a long ago teacher's diagram of a river still faintly holds in white the idea of current and bank. A queen writes his name in enormous characters across the board, then erases everything but the radical that means mouth. Speak, her palm says, not pressing, not pleading. He opens his mouth and realizes he has been living mostly in hands and eyes. He talks, and it does not matter what he says, anything is a better shape for truth than nothing. The film treats this not as epiphany but as inventory. He has voice left, now let's use it deliberately. The villain might be losing the plot he thought he authored, but the actor has the decency to play this unraveling with underhand. He sits at a table too low for his legs and keeps them folded because to extend them would require that he admit to discomfort. He puts a teacup down as if concluding arguments rather than beginning them. The lighting, which has been forgiving of everyone else's pore and scar, is uncharitable here. It finds the crust of old sleep at the edge of his eyelashes and invites us to ask whether men like him ever rest without witnesses. His aide, a woman too smart to be safe, watches him with a kind of pity that doubles as weather report. There is a consequence coming that doesn't care where you stand. The letter that follows is not an invitation or a threat, it is a prophecy disguised as bureaucracy. It announces a public ceremony to reaffirm civic bonds, code for a trap so tasteful you feel embarrassed pointing at it. It will take place at a mountainside monastery known more for its view than its piety, photographed in travel brochures as if the world had always been this polite. The queens read the event into shards and call it what it is privately, a sieve designed to separate intention from luck. They prepare less with blades than with sandals that will not betray ankles on holy stairs. Lin oils a scabbard in slow circles that equal prayer in any language. The ascent to the monastery is broad and narrow in the metaphysics of steps, wide enough to welcome, mean enough to injure. Pilgrims who believe in symbols have ground incense into the cracks for decades, the steps exhale that stubborn sweetness under pressure. The camera moves behind feet for a while, our POV becoming sole and strap, then lifts to find faces that decide what the next foot will do. Wind shows off up here. Robes film themselves. Flags find pretexts to be brave. A monk watches without theatre, his hand around a broom handle the way a sailor's hand loops itself around rope when the sea tests the deck's loyalty. The ceremony begins with offerings of fruit so carefully arranged they startle the insects into order. Officials wear the faces they have trained. Lin watches their lips. The queens watch their wrists. The score withholds, giving us the minimalism that reveals when the world tries to dress manipulation as meaning. Everything feels correct until a cadence breaks and eyes settle too long on an exit that should be unimportant. There it is. The cane that isn't a cane. The child dressed in white standing at a distance just off center frame. Not ominous, but avertible if we refuse to sleepwalk. The edit holds, taut, then cuts to a scattering of pigeons that go nowhere, a false sign because maybe the only honest signs are the ones not coordinated with a cameraman. And still the film refuses to grant us the firework. The threat arrives in a paper-thin register, a silk banner drops, hiding a passage we discover only because a queen makes a face almost impossible to see, a concentration squint that looks like someone trying to tie a knot with gloves on. She steps where no one else would, and a doorway finds itself. They move, not breaking the ceremony's dignity, sliding along the edge of its language as if it had always included this stage direction. The monks pretend not to see. They have seen worse. Sand thins underfoot. Every surface calculates friction. What follows is a geometry problem with mortal answers. Angles designed by men who love boxes try to insist that humans move in right turns. The queens answer with arcs and ellipses that accept wall and window alike and give no permission for enclosure. Lin shoulders a panel until its hinges finally admit to physics. A boy in the trap team finally meets an eye that does not look away, realizes he is human enough to put down a crossbow, and does. The villain's design is not foiled. It is made public, and that is worse for him. He has to be himself where everyone can count his movements. And then the thing the film has been avoiding, the temptation to blow the world wide, sneaks in and is strangled before it can expand. A blade glances Lin's cheek and the cut refuses to be handsome. It oozes the way skin does when confronted with surprise. A queen takes his face in one hand, pivots it exactly the amount needed to keep vision collected, and with the other hand does the small violent kindness of pinching the wound to remind flesh of how to hold itself. He winces and does not look grateful, because gratitude here would be garnish. She lets him go. She has radiance for powers he will never meet. The moment trains us, survival is choreography with music written in the ligaments. Twilight arrives late as if summoned for its taste. The city below holds out candles in windows like 1,000 insistences that are at once similar and unsame. The queens return to their compound in a mood that cannot be named with any of our domestic words. Lin walks 2 steps behind as if to protect their shadows. The door, his door now, the hinge his work, gives as designed. Inside, on a low table he has been avoiding since his return, is an object wrapped in cloth familiar as a scar. He knows it before he touches it. He knows it without doubt. The camera doesn't rush. It grants the space between the knowing and the touching, the second in which history tries to talk him out of opening his hands. He unwraps a brush. It is not new. The lacquer has been smoothed by someone else's seasons. A hairline crack runs the length of the shaft like a seam in a valley seen from above. The bristles have been clipped with the arrogant precision of someone who knows how much to take without ruining a thing. It belonged to the person who altered his registry the first time, not the man with ink-stained fingers but the one higher up the chain of command who believed that names are countries and can be colonized if you own enough inkstones. How it came here is a story the film defers. That is its genius, to reveal object, not origin, and force us to feel the difference. Lin pours water he did not know he was ready to pour. The sound is domestic and total. He rubs the ink cake in circles until the liquid goes from polite to eloquent. A queen sits near him on the floor, back against the wall, knees up, the posture of a woman who has watched versions of this moment in other lives and considers herself lucky to be present for this one. No one insists on witness. No one tells him what to write. He chooses paper that has waited its whole life for this brush. The world narrows to fiber and hair, to wet and wool. His hand hovers above the blank, tremor unhidden, the bristles drinking more than they should, the first stroke not yet spending itself into the white, that held breath a bridge that may or may not hold when the foot